You're the reason why I am my weight. You're the reason why I rip my shirts, why I eat at the buffet. Butter, you got your very own kind of nice. We all live inside a butter world. Oh, butter, gonna eat it by the stick tonight. Gonna eat out this world. Oh, butter, I'm about to take a bite, 'cause I want that salty cream. What I dream about all night. Butter dreaming. I'm about to take a bite, 'cause I want that salty cream. What I dream about all.
Welcome everyone to an episode of Study Club with Butterfield. We are joined by the wonderful co-host, Mr. Anderson.
Hey, what's
He's
going on,
that
Jay?
way. Hey, Mr. Anderson. Thanks for tuning in from across the earth, the warm land. Warm
I'll
land.
just make the time for you, Jay. Just this once.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So study club series, we review studies and try to educate everyone with what we know, and educate ourselves too, right? It's a win-win for everyone.
Exactly. We get to geek out, and we're all about the science, not your traditional science. But just because consensus opinion is not up to date with our views doesn't mean that the research isn't there, guys.
Correct.
We're just too updated. Okay. So we hope to have you along for the journey. Of course, these are more technical. The study clubs are more technical, but we try to put it down into layman terms and work on our skill to interpret these studies for you. So if you ever disagree with anything, we're open to having a discussion about it. We challenge you, as a matter of fact, to come and tell us otherwise.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
we have a great paper today. Lots of people are going to love this one.
I know, right? Many people hold a belief, right, inside of their heads about carbohydrates, whether it helps them build muscle, whether it helps them through a workout, whether it's a better fuel for the workout. All these ideas that, where do these ideas come from? Honestly, I don't know. I hope
Yeah.
people who hold these beliefs know where it comes from. So we'll get into it.
Yeah, it's just traditional bro science. I mean, I think it's fair to say a lot of what we know about the human body so far is based on a carb-centric human model, human understanding, right? And when you start diving into ketosis, into zero carb diets, into meat-heavy carnivore diets, of course, there is a lot of unexplored territory that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But so far, I think the consensus within the carnivore community is that the benefits are a net positive compared to whatever they were trying before, which was, of course, more carb-centric. So, I'm excited to dive deep into this. Of course, there's not a lot of data on carnivore diets, but this is at least some data point, and I'm sure in the next 20 or 30 years, maybe we'll get some good studies that look at zero carb diets. But
Yeah.
we'll make do with what we have today. So until
Yes.
then, we are the test subjects.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we have to pioneer this, right? Gladly, we're not the only ones. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people.
Exactly. But as usual, before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell, follow us on Instagram. Obviously, we're on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok also. Support us over there, like, share, comment. It really helps with the algorithm, get this content in front of more eyes. As you know, this is not a popular opinion. Everywhere you see is just plant-based propaganda. but support the show that way. Buy our merch. Make butter great again. Hats. We have Butterfield merch with the butter battery. Jay's wearing the hoodie. And just check out the website. We got some fun shirts we put out for Valentine's Day too. And then of course we do 2-on-1 consultations. If you'd like to check that out, check our website, check Butterfield Fitness. Just DM us the word fueled. We'd be more than happy to help you find an animal-based diet for you. Let's get to it, Jay.
Let's get to it. All right. Here we go. The effect of carbohydrate intake on strength and resistance training performance, a systematic review by the good
Systematic
guy.
review.
Systematic review, man. The sort of studies that you love. By the good friend Menno Henselmans. We follow his content a lot. He's pretty critical about everything, and right. So it'll be a good paper. The abstract. All right. So high carbohydrate intakes are commonly recommended for athletes of various sports, including strength trainees, to optimize performance.
Jay, you want to try making this bigger? Bigger on the screen?
Yeah. Whoa. So like this?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Yeah.
You got it.
Put away these bookmarks. And I want to make sure I'm not highlighting. Oh, there we go. However, the effect of carbohydrate intake on strength training performance has not been systematically analyzed. A systematic literature search was conducted for trials that manipulated carbohydrate intake, including supplements, and measured strength, resistance training, or power either acutely or after a diet and strength training program. Studies were categorized as either acute supplementation, exercise-induced glycogen depletion, with subsequent carbohydrate manipulation, short-term carbohydrate manipulation, or changes in performance after long-term diet manipulation and strength training. 49 studies were included, 19 acute, 6 glycogen depletion, 7 short-term, and 17 long-term studies. Participants were strength trainees or athletes, recreationally active or untrained. Acutely higher carbohydrate intake did not improve performance in 13 studies and enhanced performance in 6 studies, primarily in those with fasted control groups and workouts with over 10 sets per muscle group. One study found that carbohydrate meal improved performance compared to water, but in comparison to a sensory matched placebo breakfast, there was no evidence of a dose response effect. After glycogen depletion, carbohydrate supplementation improved performance in 3 studies compared to placebo, in particular during bi-daily workouts, but not in research with isocaloric controls. None of the 7 short-term studies found beneficial effects of carbohydrate manipulation. Longer-term changes in performance were not influenced by carbohydrate intake in 15 studies. 1 study favored higher and 1 lower carbohydrate condition. Carbohydrate intake per se is unlikely to strength training performance in a fed state in workouts consisting of up to 10 sets per muscle group. Performance during higher volumes may benefit from carbohydrates, but more studies with isocaloric controls, sensory matched placebos, and locally measured glycogen depletion are needed.
Yeah, so a lot of information there, but basically what they did was categorize the studies that they reviewed into four buckets, 4 bins, 4 categories, if you will. Number 1 being acute supplementation of carbohydrates, of course. Number 2, exercise-induced glycogen depletion with subsequent carbohydrate manipulation. Number 3, short-term, 2 to 7 days. And 4, longer-term diets, I believe that was like 6 weeks to 3 months. So, you can already start to see that really when we want to answer the question, how do carbohydrates impact strength training performance or muscle gains? It's a complicated question to answer. There's many things to consider, many things to control for. But, I think this study does a pretty good job of trying to systematically look at the studies and compare. So it's complicated, right? Like it's not it's not very
a simple yes.
straightforward. Yeah, exactly. So stay tuned because there's a lot of background we need to cover. But I'll read from the introduction. So, dietary carbohydrates can enhance performance in endurance sports as they are the preferred muscle energy substrate at moderate to high intensities. There is less research about carbohydrate requirements for strength training, such as Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, and bodybuilding. Resistance training is metabolically distinct from endurance training and leads to different training stimulus and adapted responses. So it may have different carbohydrate requirements. So I think it's interesting just to highlight that it's usually known that the glucose is the preferred muscle energy at moderate to high intensities. You remember those charts you'd find on like the cardio machines that say like you got to keep your heart rate at within a certain range to be in fat burning mode versus more anaerobic work. Just one of those like old school thoughts, I guess. I mean, does it really matter? I don't know. But anyways, carbohydrates can be stored as glycogen in the liver, approximately 80 to 120 grams, and muscles, approximately 350 to 700 grams. Glycogen depletion could limit performance. This is interesting. Glycogen is localized in three main subcellular compartments within the muscle cell under the sarcolemma, intermyofibrillar between the myofibrils, and intramyofibrillar within the myofibrils. That just, if you pull up like the what a muscle tissue looks like, you'll find like it'll make sense, right? It's like a little tube, and it's got like little what would you call them? Little channels that go in it. Those are the little channels that go within those tissues are the myofibrils. So basically, they're saying it's within that you find it basically in like any space, right? The sarcolemma in between the fibers and inside the fibers. Excessive glycogen depletion can contribute to muscle fatigue by lowering ATP synthesis. Endurance exercise in a significantly glycogen depleted state can also increase protein oxidation and reduce muscle protein synthesis. However, low pre-exercise glycogen availability has not been found to significantly affect anabolic signaling or muscle protein synthesis after strength training. So basically saying, low glycogen might impact, it does impact performance, but it might not necessarily impact, anabolic signaling, meaning that, even if you feel like you had a crappy workout, if you will, you're still damaging the muscle fibers, right? So you're still getting the net benefit, right? Even if you are running depleted on glycogen. Low glycogen availability per se may not be detrimental for muscle anabolism. Yeah, there you go. It can impair strength performance and training volume. In addition, strength trained individuals can achieve higher work outputs during exercise and have a greater capacity for glycogen storage compared to untrained individuals. Thus, trained individuals may require higher carbohydrate intakes to optimize performance, although training status does not seem to influence the relative level of glycogen depletion after a given resistance training workout. So that's very interesting because they're saying, the better trained you are, you might need more carbs, but also the more trained you are, the less glycogen you deplete. So it's kind of contradicting itself there. It seems to me. It's if anything, you probably need fewer carbs the more trained you are, right? I guess that's what I really understand from that suggestion. Because again, the main concern of that involves carbohydrate ingesting carbs for performance is that of glycogen, right?
And to add to that means that if you're more advanced, that doesn't mean that you're burning through more glycogen during the resistance training workout, which is interesting. Which also, I guess, kind of makes sense, right? Because advanced athletes, sure, they're lifting more weights, but they're not really eating that much more, right? I mean, it depends on where they are in their routine or cycle of bulking or cutting or whatever, preparing for a competition. they're not necessarily eating more than like the average person. They're just eating better.
Yeah, yeah, and it aligns with uh, what we know of just like adaptation, like the human body adapts to the stimulus. If you do cardio, you become more efficient at cardio, right? If you do weight training, you become more efficient at it. Like the body optimizes for the stimulus you give it. So it seems
Yeah.
like obviously a trained athlete can perform at higher intensities for relatively less calories, if you will, or whatever,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
than a total
Absolutely.
noob.
Absolutely. Uh, Skipping ahead to the methods, right? I just wanted to highlight, what methods they followed. The present systematic review followed preferred reporting items for systematic review and meta-analysis PRISMA guidelines, right? Now, this whole section here is about, what was the search strategy? What was the criteria on the studies that they were searching for? How they selected the studies and how they extracted the data. And then they analyzed the quality of the studies. Um, so yeah, jumping to the results. In total, they had 504 papers. Out of the 504 papers, they reduced it down to 19. 5 exercise-induced glycogen depletion, 7 short-term, and 17 long-term. And there were 4 abstracts that were included there as well. Right? Just gonna. This is just a chart of how the process happened. You know, study selection criteria, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So just in case the listener doesn't know what a systematic review is, what they're explaining here in the method is how they conducted basically like this massive search for any and all studies that were involved in answering the question that we're concerned with here, and then they pool together all these studies and they just review them all together, and if one study is a valuable data point, then surely like how many did they get? 17, no, 489. Surely 489 studies are more powerful data points together, right? So that's basically all they're doing. That's why they go into how they filtered for these studies, right? Basically how they conducted a complicated Google search.
Yeah, basically a
Yeah,
complicated
well,
Google search.
yeah, a complicated Google search. Layman terms.
All right. Yeah. So the effect of acute carbohydrate manipulation on strength training performance. 19 publications met the inclusion criteria. 16 studies were crossover trials. 3 studies were randomized control trials. They start talking about the composition of the group. Going to skip to the main findings. In total, 11 of the 19 acute studies found no significant effect of carbohydrate intake on strength training performance. Of the 8 studies with significant effect between group effect, 6 favored higher carbohydrate condition. 5 studies reported more repetitions to failure, a training volume, but not peak power. So 8 studies had significant effect. 6 of those studies said, 6 that favored higher carbohydrate condition, 5 of them allow them to do more repetitions, but not produce more peak power compared to the low carb or the control group, right? And 1 study reported greater isokinetic performance. In these studies, the higher carbohydrate conditions are also had a higher energy intake. There you go. That is actually very key. All of these that favor the higher carbohydrate condition also had higher energy intake. That seems kind of obvious that if you were to eat more energy, you were going to perform better. This may explain why they were not able to produce higher peak power, right? They just had more energy to produce more work. because the control condition were either continuing their overnight fast or received a non-caloric placebo after an overnight fast, or in an unspecified state. Receive 5.5 grams of amino acids or non-caloric placebo 3 to 5 hours after a meal. None of the isocaloric comparisons found higher carbohydrate condition had a greater performance than the lower carbohydrate condition. So isocaloric, once you equate the calories between the two groups, there seems to be no greater performance between carb and no carb or lower carb.
That's right. Those guys were eating more calories. It's easy to overeat calories once you're ingesting carbs.
Yeah.
So if you feel like adding carbs to your diet improved your performance, ask yourself, did you calorie equate, or are you simply consuming more calories?
True. Yeah, a lot of people who go on low carb are just naturally eating less, and then they think, oh, I'm producing worse. My performance at the gym is worse, right? But that's just a function of eating less energy.
Exactly. Because they don't track, they don't count, and they get told it doesn't matter. So common sense goes out the window, right? Calories matter, guys, of course.
Yes. In here, it's just all the studies that were looked at. Let me see if I can zoom out a little bit. All the studies that were looked at for this section, no significant differences between conditions in weightlifted, the last set, and total training set, carbohydrate intake, placebo, timings. It's basically like a table of all the studies for this section. We're going to skip ahead. Yeah, you can see that it's a bunch, but it's very nicely put down there. And this chart over here is like a summary. 19 studies. What were the strength tests? Fed state, fasted state, unspecified state. The results, right? 11 had no effect, 6 showed greater effect, and 2 showed that the placebo was better, I think, or no effects or something. Placebo was better, which is always interesting when you hear placebo having a significant effect. So here, positive effects of carbohydrate intake were more prevalent when compared to fasts of 4 or more hours, but the effect of fasting duration was not clear. So, consume carbohydrates, you're going to perform better. In 6 studies of a relatively fed state with no more than 5 hours of fasting, 3 studies found no significant effects of carbohydrate intake after 2 to 4 hour fasts. One found a non-significant trend for benefits in some of the outcome measurements after a 4-hour fast, and 2 studies found a positive effect of supplementing carbohydrates after 3 or 5 hour fast in some but not all tested outcomes. In the 11 studies comparing carbohydrate intake to an overnight fasted state, 1 found a benefit of carbohydrates for both measured outcomes. 2 found a benefit for some, but not all for the performance measurements. 7 found no significant effects of carbohydrate intake, and 1 found detrimental effect. Positive findings of carbohydrate intake compared to fasting are not necessarily indicative of a metabolic advantage of carbohydrate consumption. Basically, again, repeating the point that, hey, you're comparing positive carbohydrate intake performance versus a group that was fasting. That's not really telling you, oh, higher carbohydrate is better. Carbohydrate dosage and training volume. Do you want to read this, Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, I got it. So, it begs the question, right? Like, if there's some marginal benefit to some carbs, is there more benefit to more carbs? And the answer is there was no dose-response effect of carbohydrate intake on performance. Significant effects were observed with dosages as low as 0.27 grams per kilogram, 0.81, and 1.5, yet not found in 5 studies with 0.2 to all the way to 0.59 grams per kilogram. One study, Craig's et al., studied the effects of 15 grams per hour, 30 grams per hour, and 60 grams per hour of carbs versus placebo on strength training, running, and jumping performance. Supplementing with carbs significantly improved performance compared to placebo only in the bench press at all doses, and for the 27-meter sprint only at the 60 gram per hour dosage without any dose response effect. In fact, the 15 gram per hour group significantly outperformed the 60 gram per hour group for the bench press and a total repetitions across all resistance training exercises. In absolute terms, the highest number of repetitions were achieved for the bench press, bent over row, triceps extension in the 15 gram per hour carb group, and for the bicep curls in the 30 grams per hour carb group, none for the 60 grams per hour carbohydrate group, right? So basically just reiterating, there was no dose response effect. So more carbs did not mean better performance necessarily.
Yeah.
2 other studies comparing multiple doses also found no effects of carb dosage on performance. The lower and higher carb drinks both improved leg press repetition performance identically compared to the placebo drink. Okay, so there you go. Placebo having, same effect as the carbs. Positive effects of higher carbohydrate intakes were more consistent in higher training volume workouts. In studies with performance tests consisting of more than 10 sets per muscle group, significant positive effects of higher carbohydrate intake or a trend thereof were observed in 3 studies, whereas 1 study found no significant effects. Okay, so out of 14 studies, lower volume performance tests, 3 studies significantly favored the carbohydrate conditions, and 2 favored the lower carbohydrate conditions. Okay, so whenever there were 11 to 17 sets targeting a muscle group, there seemed to be a somewhat marginal benefit to the higher carb ingestion, but not anything below that, right? Results from published abstracts. 3 published abstracts involved acute carbohydrate manipulation. 2 of those observed no effect of carb intake on multiple sets of squats to failure. And 1 study found a carb supplement consumed in a semi-fasted state resulted in more repetitions during the last set of leg presses, but there was no effect for total repetitions of either the bench press or leg press. Okay, so mixed results all across the board, but generally the trend is, no obvious benefit.
Yeah, no obvious benefit to the dose amount of carbohydrates. The effect of exercise-induced glycogen depletion and carbohydrate manipulation in acute strength training performance. Right. When training fasted, glycogen concentrations decreased by 19.2% after the squats, rising to 40.7% after the isokinetic exercise. So glycogen, so basically you're saying you burn 20% of your glycogen after doing squats, and then burning even more after you did the isokinetic exercise. So like a leg press, or no, sorry, like hamstring curl, or the leg extension.
Yeah.
When training after consuming 1 grams per kilogram carbohydrate pre-workout and every 10-minute intra-workout, the depletion levels were reduced to 15.2% and 26.5% respectively. So having carbs seems to restore glycogen levels. The 5 other studies did not measure glycogen levels, but instead designed their exercise-induced glycogen depletion to deplete glycogen stores by 80% via bicycling based on previous work or high volume 15 sets strength training. So that sounds pretty painful.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, that sucks. Imagine being a test subject and you're like, okay, let's deplete your glycogen by 80%. And they put you on a bicycle and you keep doing that until you are 80% gone in terms of energy. That's not easy. Similarly, they told you to do 15 sets of a strength training exercise. That's, try doing 15 sets of squats, man. Yeah, not easy. So what were the main findings, right? After doing all this glycogen depletion, 3 of the studies favored higher carbohydrate intake over the non-caloric conditions. Compared to a non-caloric placebo or unspecified condition, 2 studies observed significantly more repetitions to failure in the high carbohydrate conditions. So again, the language makes you think, oh, higher carb is better, right? But they were being compared to non-caloric placebo, right? So the control group, the people that were getting compared against with, were basically eating 0 calories, placebo. So high carb versus 0 calories. One study observed higher average power outputs. The only calorie match experiment by Mitchell found no significant between group differences in total training volume during the 15 sets of quadriceps strength training. So basically, the only experiment where they matched for calories for energy, there was no difference. There were no significant between group differences in isometric strength, total work, neuromuscular fatigue, or peak or average torque. In addition, no group differences were observed in total work, peak, or average torque compared to non-caloric placebo condition in Half et al. There we go. Carbohydrate dosage and training volume. You want me to keep going, or you want to?
Yeah, keep going.
All right. Training volume did not clearly mediate the effect of carbohydrate intake on strength training performance. Similarly, no dose response of carbohydrate intake was evident, with a lack of an effect at 1.9 grams per kilogram and 7.7 grams per kilogram. Right. So, yeah, kind of like similar theme as the prior paragraph or prior section. It all varies depending on how many carbs you were having, either no carbs or some carbs. So yes, I like this chart because it kind of summarizes everything. 6 studies, 9 participants. What were they doing? They were depleting themselves by 80% by cycling or 40% by using strength exercises. What was the carbohydrate intake? 1.1 to 1.8. And what was the control diet? It was non-caloric placebo of, 3 studies had non-caloric placebo and 3 studies had low carbohydrates, right? So, which, if you look at this section over here, sort of explains the results as well. 3 studies had no effect. 3 studies, the higher carbohydrate was better. And that was because they were just comparing people that had carbohydrates versus people that had no carbohydrates or any food.
Yeah, so basically fed versus not fed.
Yeah, basically. Exactly.
That's funny.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, basically, they're calling it a carbohydrate study, but it's really fed versus unfed study. And yeah, here are all the studies, all the studies that were used. 3.3.
Yeah, so we covered, acute supplementing, and then glycogen depletion, and then acute supplementing, right? So now, this section is concerned with, the short-term results. So, effect of short-term carbohydrate manipulation on acute strength training performance. 7 studies investigated short-term effect of higher carb versus lower carb were included. These studies lasted for a duration of 48 hours to 1 week, so for an average of 5 days. Daily carb intakes in the lower carb conditions range from 31 to 346 grams, with an average of 160 grams, compared to 165 to 672 grams, with an average of 390 grams in the higher carb conditions. So, not necessarily within the keto range, but you can see the range is pretty widespread across the 7 studies that were included. But, so what did they find? None of the 5 randomized studies found significant effects of carbohydrate intake on performance, including the only isocaloric study and one of the 2 non-randomized crossover trials. A crossover trial by Sawyer et al. Favored the lower carb condition for some measures, but due to a lack of randomization or counterbalancing, it was confounded by a possible order familiarity effect. Okay, and here's the wonderful diagrams provided by the group that worked with Menno. Shout out to them for these cute diagrams.
Yes.
Yeah, they really do a great job of explaining what happens. So here we have 7 short-term studies, 2 to 7 days for crossover, and 3 randomized control trials. There were strength-trained athletes, CrossFit athletes, and then some of them were untrained and recreationally active. Here we have the range of the carb intake, pretty widespread. Strength tests, training to failure, power tests, isokinetic performance, and CrossFit. One study. What is that doing there? And then results. Basically all of it was not significant except for the one study by Sawyer et al. But it was possibly confounded. And the study does a good job of breaking this down in the discussion. But then as we scroll down, we can see that only one study was isocaloric, and then the other ones were non-isocaloric. And over here, the only one that had a significant, basically all of them, they have no significant differences in performance or in strength, except Sawyer et al., which, it saw a significantly, if you keep scrolling down, so Sawyer et al., which found significantly greater hand grip strength, squat 1 rep max, and vertical jump height in the carbohydrate restricted condition compared to the control condition. No differences in other measurements. So there you have it. Pretty, nothing too shocking. And again, keep in mind that the average duration of these studies were 5 days. So with this makes the next section even more interesting, because this is the 4th category of studies that they looked at, and that was the effect of longer-term carb diets and strength training on changes in strength performance. So here they included 17 studies that examined the long-term effects of different carb intakes. Study durations range from 3 weeks to 3 months, with an average of 8 weeks. Daily carb intakes range from 15 grams to 347, average 100 grams in the lower carb groups, and 82 to 758 grams. That's way too many carbs, guys. With an average of 330 grams in the higher carb groups. 6 of the 13 ketogenic diet studies also monitored and confirmed ketosis with measuring ketone levels. So, perhaps these longer-term studies are perhaps better studies to answer the question that that is at hand. Given that the lower carb groups, some of them were ketogenic indeed. Cute diagram again. 17 long-term studies. 9 of them for strength training. 6 of them were for military trained people or athletes, and then 2 were for untrained or active individuals. You can look at the range of the carb intake. High carbohydrates, average 330. Low carb, average 100 grams. Which 100 grams, I guess that classifies as a low carb diet on average, right? And then for results, most of them had no effect. Again, one of them favored the higher carb intake, and one of them favored the lower carb intake. So what is actually going on? We'll take a look. If we keep scrolling down, here's the table again. Isocaloric, isonitrogenous studies. And just to highlight, the carb intakes that they were seeing. The first one says 41 grams compared to 223. You have another one with 44 grams compared to 187. The next study, 83 grams compared to 171. And, they were looking at things like people like power lifters, Olympic weightlifters, CrossFit athletes, LOL, even some overweight individuals. Just to show that these the kind of workouts that the kind of training that they were doing. We have more CrossFit. There's CrossFit in all of these categories, but then of course, some strength training folks. So if you keep scrolling down, you'll see the one that found a significant result was Ryu and Cho. They looked at grip strength, back strength, and repetitions of sit-ups performed in 60 seconds, 100 meters sprint, Wingate peak and mean power, and fatigue index, and standing broad jump distance. They found no significant differences between groups in changes in any performance outcomes, except for a significantly lower lower anaerobic fatigue index during the Wingate test in the ketogenic group. Yeah.
Nice.
And keep on looking. There's the other study, Vargas Molina et al. They found a significantly greater increase in changes of 1 rep max for squat and bench press in the non-ketogenic diet group, with no group differences in the CMJ performance. I'm not sure what CMJ is, but anyways, moving on. So one for one is what they had. So performance measurements included isokinetic knee flexion, extension strength tests in 2 studies, 1 rep max, 10 rep max performance in 1 trial, repetitions to failure, total training volume, CrossFit performance, whatever that means, in 2 studies, and grip strength and various predominantly anaerobic athletic tests in 6 studies. Just so you get a sense, right? Because when you're trying to answer this question, how do you measure for strength, right? That could be a whole study in and of itself. What's the best marker for strength, right? So they're kind of looking at everything here. But anyways, moving on to the main findings. The single study favoring the higher carb condition was Vargas Molina et al., who found significantly greater 1 rep max squat and bench press strength development, but not counter movement jump. Oh, that's CMJ, counter movement jump height after an 8-week higher carb diet. The high carb diet group also consumed more total calories. Oh my God! Well, there you have it, resulting in fat loss in the ketogenic group, but not the higher carb group. Okay, so the one study again, the one study that showed benefit for the carb ingestion was indeed higher calorie, as we saw previously in the other categories of studies that they looked at. So the single study favoring the low carb ketogenic diet group was Ryu and Cho, who found the lower Wingate fatigue index compared to the non-ketogenic diet group. However, there were no significant between group differences in Wingate maximal strength, 100-meter sprint, and or broad jump performance. Okay, so yeah, I believe the Wingate test. So I just looked it up. Is just to have a definition, is an anaerobic exercise test most often performed on a stationary bicycle that measures peak anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity. It can also be performed on an arm crank ergometer, consists of a set time pedaling at maximum speed given a resistance. Okay, so what they're saying here is basically, the keto group was less fatigued after that test. But there was actually no difference for performance. Okay, we'll believe the guys who said, we'll believe them.
Yeah.
All right, now we are almost at the top of the hour. We'll have to blast through this discussion section, Jay.
Let's blast right through it. So discussion, majority 39 out of 49 studies, including 16 isocaloric comparisons, found no significant benefits of carbohydrate manipulation or strength training performance. Similarly, 3 of the 4 published abstracts found no significant effects of carbohydrate intake. 10 studies found that carbohydrate consumption might enhance strength training performance in specific contexts, notably for otherwise fasted training. So it's beneficial if you're coming from a fasted state. And workouts with volumes greater than 10 sets or by daily workouts, 2 workouts per day. 4 studies favored lower carbohydrate condition, but these benefits may have been attributable to study confounders, such as having higher protein intake rather than carbohydrate restriction. So the effect of acute carbohydrate manipulation on strength training performance. 11 studies found no significant effects of carbohydrate intake in strength training performance. 6 studies found significantly greater performance in higher carbohydrate conditions, and 2 studies found significantly greater performance in lower carbohydrate conditions. Since there is no established mechanism by which carbohydrates could acutely impair performance, the 2 studies finding negative effects of carbohydrates may be type 1 errors. Both were consumed after an overnight fast by strength training men and women. However, the authors interpret their findings primarily as a null effect rather than an effect of favoring lower carbohydrate intake. The high protein drink. So they're talking about a study here specifically where they gave participants a high carb drink or a high protein drink. The high protein drink resulted in a greater performance on aggregate test performance, though not on any individually analyzed test. Then they go on to theorize as to why that may happen. Protein's positive effect may have resulted from greater muscle protein synthesis and subsequent recovery. So because you're having a higher protein drink, your body starts repairing these muscles right away, perhaps improving your recovery, thereby improving your performance. Thus, Lynch's findings may be interpreted as a null effect of carbohydrate intake and positive effect of protein intake, not a positive effect of carbohydrate restriction. Protein intake has similar effects on performance as carbohydrate, basically.
Yeah, and this was a protein shake, unfortunately.
Yes.
It'd be awesome if they're downing a slunk.
Some eggs. Yeah. So this section was pretty interesting. Muscle contractions during both low and high-low resistance training rely primarily on the aerobic glycolysis pathway for energy, as there is insufficient oxygen to rely purely on an aerobic system and fatty acid to provide energy sufficiently rapid. Glucose and glycogen are therefore primary energy substrates to fuel anaerobic exercise, such as resistance training. Basically saying, you're not producing energy quickly through an anaerobic process. That's why you're using glycogen. So you're not using fatty acids. But then, what's interesting is, however, the total energy expenditure of strength training is generally lower than that of endurance type activities. One reason for the lower energy expenditure is that the involvement of the eccentric muscle contraction, so lowering the weight, depending on the exercise. But in a bicep curl, you're lowering the weight, which require relatively little energy expenditure compared to concentric muscle contractions, because they involve biomechanical rather than chemical cleaving of acting myosin cross bridges. Second, strength training exercises is very intermittent, with often 1 to 3 minute rest after each exercise. These rest periods allow the aerobic system, which can be refueled by fatty acids rather than carbohydrates. So while you're taking rest, you're using fatty acids to rest yourself, to recover yourself. Also, what was also pretty interesting, to contribute a considerable portion of work's total energy expenditure, estimates range substantially from 20 to 70% of resistance training energy expenditure. So that, they're talking about using the aerobic system, contributing to 20 to 70% of the resistance training energy expenditure. Moreover, many sets are short enough that the creatine phosphate system, relying on creatine and stored ATP, can contribute approximately 16% of the energy demands of a set of high-intensity resistance training, with 31% contributions being possible with shorter duration anaerobic efforts. So basically saying, okay, so 20 to 70% of your energy comes from the aerobic system, and then 16%, potentially 31%, comes from creatine and ATP while you're doing those anaerobic activities. Right? So the creatine phosphate and aerobic systems may contribute more during a low carbohydrate diet. So you may see an upregulation of these both systems when you're in a low carb diet. Um, and so, yeah, assuming a hypothetical but realistic training session, energy expenditure of 500 calories. So you do a resistance training session and you burn 500 calories. That would require 80 grams of carbohydrates, right? So you assume 500 grams of glycogen are stored in your entire body. You're only burning 16% of your glycogen through that workout. Empirically, higher glycogen depletion levels have been reported, ranging between 41 to 39% if we exclude isokinetic exercises. And glycogen depletion only starts affecting neuromuscular functioning when levels are reduced to approximately 250 to 300 millimolars per kilogram dry weight. Thus, resistance training workouts generally likely do not deplete enough glycogen to impair performance, right? So you're using the creatine system, you're using the ATP system, you're using the aerobic system. Overall, you're really not burning that many carbs. You're maybe burning 16% of your glycogen, up to 41% or 39%. Um, so people who are burning through their glycogen system in a low carb diet, they're not really experiencing impaired performance of glycogen depletion. And this glycogen depletion may happen when it's greater than 40%. Also, doing an overnight fast is not enough to induce low glycogen levels. Liver glycogen content decreases overnight fasting. Intramuscular glycogen stores are not a substrate to main blood glucose concentrations and therefore are not depleted. So in an overnight fast, your liver is contributing to your glycogen stores, but not your muscle glycogen. Therefore, muscle glycogen levels are not likely to be limiting factors for strength training performance, or at least in the lower volume studies. Mr. Anderson, welcome back.
Back from the dead.
Yes. Nevertheless, critical depletion of type 2 muscle fibers after high volume strength training could explain the trend in the literature that acute ergogenic effects of carbohydrate intake are more prevalent, although not consistent in workouts of more than 10 sets per muscle group. So again, the study was saying, this paper is saying, if you're doing more than 10 sets per muscle group, it seems like not every time, but it seems like the trend is that it may be beneficial. In 14 of the studies with test workouts with 10 or fewer sets per muscle group, there were only 3 studies in favor of higher carbohydrate intakes, 9 studies reporting no effect, and 2 studies favoring lower carbohydrate intake. However, none of these studies favoring higher carbohydrate intakes had isocaloric control groups. So again, you run into the problem of the studies that favor carbohydrates are not energy matching. The lack of isocaloric controls makes it impossible to determine whether superior performance in some studies can be attributed to carbohydrate intake per se. Right, so that's like the main point of this. Researchers found that high carb breakfast improved resistance training performance compared to drinking only water after an overnight fast. However, if you drink a flavor and texture matched placebo breakfast with only 29 calories, improved performance similarly. So a high carb breakfast versus a 29 calorie placebo breakfast, equal performance. The sham breakfast also reduced hunger similarly. Thus, feeling of having consumed something can be more important than carbohydrate intake per se. So if you if you wake up and you feel like you consumed something, even though it's not really anything, that may help your performance. However, in a 30-minute endurance sport, after if that 30-minute endurance sport was above 30 minutes, the sham breakfast, the low calorie, no placebo breakfast, was better than just consuming water, but it wasn't better compared to the high carbohydrate intake, right? At that point, it makes sense. After 30 minutes of workout, the placebo effect is not gonna cover you.
That's very
Moving on.
interesting. So have an egg. Just have one egg for your pre-workout.
Yeah, you could have one egg, and that will give you the feeling that you consumed something, the taste that you had something, and actual energy from it. I like it. Uh, so yeah, this other point kind of highlights another very interesting finding where having a solid meal compared to a liquid meal suggests that the semi-solid meal had better performance, suggests that hunger suppression can have a positive effect on resistance training. Since all the studies finding benefit higher carbohydrate intake also had higher energy intake, none of these effects may have been necessarily mediated by a carbohydrate intake per se, but rather by hunger suppression, resulting in higher training efforts. So the feeling that you're no longer hungry could help your gym performance. Moreover, other studies have found that carbohydrate mouth rinsing without actual carbohydrate consumption can improve resistance training repetition performance compared to placebo, and that any placebo mouth rinse, regardless of carbohydrate content, can improve performance compared to water consumption. So even just the feeling that you had something in your water that's not in your mouth that's not water can improve your performance.
Brush your teeth.
Yeah, brush your teeth in the morning and you're performing better. Uh, so yeah, again, higher carbohydrate performance could be explained by the feeding or rather taste experience. So in conclusion, carbohydrate intake per se, independent of energy intake, is mechanistically and statistically unlikely to acutely affect resistance training performance in a fed state for workouts up to 10 sets per muscle group. There is a clear need for more isocaloric research with realistic placebos. Um, is, you know, and then the group goes on to provide a recommendation. Perhaps if you consume at least 15 grams of net carbohydrates within 3 hours of pre-workout to optimize performance. If your workout has more than 10 sets per muscle group, higher carbs may be warranted. All right, so the effect of exercise-induced glycogen depletion and carbohydrate manipulation in acute strength performance. 3 out of the 6 studies that included glycogen depletion session prior to strength test found a positive effect of carbohydrate intake on performance. Man, I keep popping this up. All right, so it is likely that glycogen levels were below the threshold of impairing neuromuscular functioning after depletion workouts, so it is plausible that higher carbohydrate intakes help bring glycogen stores back up to less limiting levels before the strength training test workouts. Higher carbohydrate intakes were mainly beneficial in studies with short recovery times in between depletion and test workouts. 2 favored the higher carbohydrate condition. Only half et al. Found no benefit at carbohydrate intake compared to fasting to the workout output. In the 3 studies with 48 hours in between 2 workouts, only 1 favored the higher carbohydrate condition. Only Leverett and Abernathy favored the higher carbohydrate condition, and this study was confounded by only performing depletion workout in lower carbohydrate condition. Since participants were only recreationally trained men, it is possible that the depletion workout interfered with performance due to muscle damage or otherwise incomplete recovery rather than glycogen depletion. 2 days may be enough time for complete glycogen resynthesis even on a low carbohydrate diet, while high carb diet intakes are needed to resynthesize glycogen stores after exhaustive exercise as fast as possible. Glycogen stores are partly autoregulated as glycogen content is inversely related to glycogen synthase 1 activity, thereby allowing faster glycogen resynthesis after depletion, at least if substrate is available. So yeah, basically carbohydrates helps fill your glycogen stores. So you're going to see people who consume carbohydrates after a depletion workout perform better. However, a considerable amount of glucose, up to daily requirements during starvation, can also be obtained from dietary fat intake or adipose tissue via gluconeogenesis from the glycerol backbone of triglycerides. Basically, you can make glucose out of your fat cells, the adipose tissue. Third, glucose can be produced from gluconeogenic amino acids, although this may only be desirable from a muscular anabolic point of view if the amino acids are consumed in excess of requirements for muscle protein synthesis. And then, again, to just repeat that point, none of the studies that favor higher carb conditions were isocaloric. So all the studies that show higher carbohydrate performance after a depleted glycogen workout, they all were not isocaloric. The only isocaloric study in this category by Mitchell et al. Found no significant between group differences in the total training volume during 15 sets of resistance training at 15 rep max to failure after a glycogen depletion workout followed by a carbohydrate intake of 32 grams per day or 643 grams per day for 48 hours in strength trained men. A lack of isocaloric comparisons is particularly confounding in studies with prior glycogen depletion workouts. Again, so isocaloric, they're not isocaloric. Glycogen depletion workouts are by nature exhaustive and generally a novel stimulus, so they have the potential to induce significant muscle damage and neuromuscular fatigue that may take over 48 hours to recover from. Additionally, glycogen depletion after a novel workout may not reflect the depletion level experienced by trainees habituated to that training stimulus and low carbohydrate diets, although other research finds no habituation effects. In conclusion, higher carbohydrate intakes are likely warranted for maximum performance when performing more than one glycogen depleted workout per day. So if you're working out more than once a day, so twice, and each workout is glycogen depleting, perhaps carbohydrates is good. If there are more than a few hours in between workouts, carbohydrate intakes up to 1.2 grams per kilogram may be warranted to maximize glycogen resynthesis and subsequent performance. Man.
Very well, and I found it interesting that the one isocaloric study compared 32 grams or 643 grams, and they found no significant difference when the groups were training to a 15 rep max. So
yeah,
that's a pretty big carb intake difference.
That's pretty huge. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Good point.
But moving on, the effect of short-term carb manipulation on acute strength training performance, right? So none of the 7 short-term experiments found any positive effects on acute strength training performance following 2 to 7 days of a higher carb intake compared to a lower carb intake. The one study that found a significant change, one study by Sawyer et al. Favored the low carb condition, but it was not randomized or counterbalanced. In this study, 31 strength trainees switched over from a 41% carb intake to a 5% carb intake for a week before completing a battery of strength tests. After a low-carb diet, the participants had lost body weight due to a 15% lower total energy intake, yet hand grip strength, squat, 1 rep max, and vertical jump height improved significantly compared to earlier testing during the high-carb diet, although the squat strength improvement was only 0.9 kilograms. Bench press, 1 rep max, power and repetitions to failure, and Wingate power output did not significantly change. Since the study design was not randomized, the improvements in the lower carb condition may have been due to familiarization or training effect rather than the diet, although the authors discounted this possibility based on the short study duration in comparison to the minimum 2 years of previous training experience of the participants. So what they're suggesting here is, they likely saw this this benefit in their performance, not necessarily because of the diet, but because over that short-term week, they became more habituated to the exercise. But the authors from that paper suggest otherwise. 1 week relative to the 2 years where these guys have been training isn't really that significant for them to become so habituated that they saw this this improvement in their performance. And also, mind you, they did lose weight during this short-term study, and they were consuming 15% lower calories. So, they lost weight, they were in a deficit, and they seemed to perform better. Interesting. Another possible confounder was that protein intake increased significantly in the low-carb diet, although it still averaged 145 grams per day during the higher carb diet, and the higher carb diet had higher energy intake. Okay, so maybe protein is playing a role here. The lack of benefits of carb intake in the short-term studies can be understood based on glycogen metabolism. The participants mostly performed habitual training sessions with no more than 10 sets per muscle group, so it is likely that glycogen availability was not a limiting factor for their workouts. Okay, so if the glycogen was not a limiting factor for the workouts, then that could explain why there was no noticeable difference between the different carb ingestions, right? So they go on to explain here, participants had at least 24 hours in between workouts in all the studies, which was likely sufficient for full glycogen replenishment, okay? So if they're not depleting the glycogen, doing one workout a day, different carb intakes, within the next day, their glycogen was properly replenished, low or high carb, right? In conclusion, strength trainees are unlikely to be limited by the carb intake to fuel habitual strength training workouts with no more than 10 sets per muscle group. So there you have it. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're strength training, you're not replenishing you're not depleting your glycogen. So ingesting more carbs is very likely to do little for your performance based on the glycogen replenishing. So what happens when we look at the long-term studies, effects of longer-term carb diets and strength training on changes in strength performance. So a total of 16 out of 17 long-term studies found no significant benefits of carb manipulation on strength training performance and strength development, including all isocaloric and isonitrogenous trials, so equating for calories, equating for protein. One study favored the lower carb condition, and one study favored the higher carb condition. So across, pretty mixed results. The only study favoring the higher carb condition was Vargas Molina et al. They found greater increases in squat and bench press strength and fat-free mass, but not counter-movement jump height in the higher carb condition. Despite the instruction to consume a similar energy intake, the lower carb keto group resulted in lower self-reported energy intake and significantly more fat loss. None of the other 9 keto diets found attenuated strength development, and the greater improvement in the higher carb condition may have been due to the energy surplus in that group versus the energy deficit in the ketogenic group, rather than carbohydrate intake. Although a recent meta-analysis did not find significant detrimental effects of a daily 567 kilocalorie energy deficit on strength development. So they're saying, the one study that showed that was in favor of the high carb condition could have been was likely confounded by the higher energy intake. Again, no surprise. This seems to be a common theme across all the studies that they reviewed. The one study favoring the lower carb condition was Ryu and Cho, which found reduced anaerobic fatigue during the Wingate test in the lower carb condition, but none of the other performance tests favored the low carb condition. So that finding is questionable. Rightly so. Overall, results indicate that carb intake does not have much, if any, effect on long-term resistance training performance in isonitrogenous.
Oh, Mr. Anderson, we're losing you.
Yeah,
oh,
that's crazy.
You're coming back.
I'm still here, right?
Yeah.
All right. So carb independent. So they go on to.
Oh yeah. We're back to losing you, Mr. Anderson.
All right. Yeah, third world Wi-Fi is really kicking in. It's an interesting term, right? Third world. Is there a second world? I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Anyhow, the carb-independent pathways by which the body can synthesize glucose may be sufficient in the context of sustainable training volumes and recovery times in between workouts. Vårvik et al. Compared the glycogen depletion and recovery of ultra-endurance athletes on a habitual 59% carb diet to those on a habitual 10% carb diet after a 3-hour run. 90 minutes pre-workout and immediately post-workout, the participants consumed an isocaloric and isonitrogenous protein shake with either 5% carbs for the lower carb dieters or 50% carb for the high carb dieters. Despite the large difference in habitual pre-exercise and post-exercise carb intake, resting glycogen concentrations were similar between groups. They decreased similarly during the workouts, and they recovered similarly over 2 hours, back to 34 to 38% depletion. Other research finds habituated exercise in carb-restricted conditions may decrease reliance on glycogen, although all research so far is on endurance rather than strength training. Finney et al. Is this Stephen Finney? Found that during a ketogenic protein-sparing modified fast with endurance training, muscle glycogen levels stabilized at 69% of baseline after 6 weeks on this diet, compared to 57% of baseline after the first week. So, that was all a lot of words, but basically what they're saying is in that study by Vårvik or Finney, what they're showing is, as far as measuring the depletion and the replenishing of glycogen, it doesn't really seem to make a lot of difference in people who are habitually trained, right? So when they say habitually trained, is someone who trains in that activity regularly, right? So, in other words, I would dare to say that this is someone who is adapted to that kind of exercise. But again, it doesn't really seem to make a difference. And this is in endurance athletes, right? 3-hour run. Okay, so that's pretty exhausting stuff. 3 hours. Oh my God. But there you have it. So there's those interesting data points. Doesn't really seem to make much of a difference. Then we go on. Most of these studies found no significant between group differences in the measures of body composition and thereby presumably muscle mass. However, 5 studies found a between group difference favoring the higher carb condition, with either a decrease in the lower carb group compared to an increase in the higher carb group. So we're talking about fat-free mass. However, aforementioned Vargas Molina et al. Found greater increases in strength in the higher carb condition was confounded by significantly lower intake in the lower carb condition, right? So what they're saying is higher carb showed favorable fat-free mass change, but again, they were consuming more energy, right? Nothing too controversial there. And then last point, notably, Wilson et al. Demonstrated that 1 week of carb reintroduction after a 10-week ketogenic diet increased fat-free mass by 4.8%, while no change was observed in the traditional high-carb group. Thus, the overall literature does not support lower carb diets impair muscle development when accounting for energy intake and glycogen storage levels. However, from a practical standpoint, it seems more challenging to consume a target energy surplus in ketogenic diets, possibly due to the appetite suppressive effect of keto diets. Muscular development is significantly affected by energy balance. So there you have it. Before you start crying for my carbs, count your calories and again, experiment for yourself, right? But nevertheless, based on the systematic review of the available literature, carb intake does not seem to have much, if any, effect on strength development up to 3 months duration.
Sweet.
People, anyone who's arguing that you need the carbs, or you just, you just got to put the work. You got to put the work.
You got to put the work.
If you want to build strength, you want to build muscle, you got to put the work.
Yeah.
Like looking for the hacks here and there, like it's gonna make no difference. You got to put the work. Right?
You got to put the work.
Yeah.
And people always confound, when people go on a weight loss journey and they're like, oh, I feel like I'm losing strength. I don't have enough energy. I mean, that's probably because you've been losing weight for a while now. And that's a byproduct of energy balance, right? You can continue losing weight, but it's going to become harder and harder to start performing even greater and greater at the gym.
Exactly. Pretty much.
Yes. Conclusions and practical applications. The majority of research, including every isocaloric comparison, did not find higher carbohydrate intakes improve strength training performance either acutely or over a course of strength training program. Compared to lower carbohydrate intakes, there is also evidence that positive effects of higher carbohydrate intakes in comparison to nothing or less filling controls can be non-metabolic. possibly mediated by hunger suppression and subsequently greater exercise efforts. However, subgrouping the studies shows that carbohydrate manipulation may be beneficial in certain contexts, namely otherwise fasted training, workouts with more than 10 sets per muscle group, and bi-daily workouts. Whew, there we go.
Yeah, I want to read this part too. Glycogen resynthesis after such depletion may be complete within 24 hours, even on low carb intakes, via carb independent pathways, especially in trainees habituated to the training in low carb conditions. So there's no such thing as an essential dietary carbohydrate, as far as I know.
Yeah,
we can literally excess carbs turn into fat. Equally, we can turn fat into glucose in our body. So
that's what this is saying here. Glycogen resynthesis, right? That you can produce glycogen from the glycerol backbone of the triglyceride, and that makes your glucose. And after 24 hours of your workout, where you depleted your glycogen, you're turning that fat into glycogen, thereby replenishing your glycogen stores and ready to hit the gym 24 hours later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the last portion, overall, our findings indicate conventional high carb intake recommendations of 40 to 10 grams per kilogram may be excessive for the performance of strength trainees. Based on the inconclusive evidence of potential for benefits but not harm, strength trainees are advised to consume at least 15 gram carbohydrates and 0.3 grams per kilogram protein within 3 hours of their training sessions. If the workout contains 11 or more sets per muscle group, or there is another high-intensity workout planned that day for the same musculature, higher carb intakes up to 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour may be warranted to maximize glycogen resynthesis in between workouts. May be warranted, and they're saying based on inconclusive evidence. I wonder what would happen if, maybe you do have another bout of exercise within the same day. What happens if you just eat like a few tablespoons of butter? Could that fat be turned into glucose almost immediately and replenish glycogen? I don't know the answer to that. That's just a silly question.
That is true, because the studies were, he's only saying this because the studies where he showed that double workouts in a day are benefit from carbohydrate consumption is because they were just testing for carbohydrate consumption. What if you just replace the carbohydrates and test for fat consumption? What would you see? The theme that we've caught on so far is that it's all about the energy balance. Are you consuming equal amounts of energy compared to the carbohydrate group? There's no difference. So probably same logic applies here. If you're doing double workouts in that same day, maybe consume the equal amount of energy you would consume in carbs in fat, and then you can probably replenish your glycogen stores. But there you have it, man.
Precisely.
There you have it.
Long story short, most of the data seems to suggest that it doesn't make a difference. So,
man,
if you believe it makes a difference, this was a lot to cover. 39 pages, 33 pages, 33. If you believe you need the carbs for better performance, then you're basically limiting yourself to not be able to perform up to your highest level without carbs, if this is what you believe. Okay.
True.
Don't forget about the power of belief. It's probably the biggest, the most anabolic substance available in this universe. The power of your brain. We're still gonna get the carb copers. Again, carbs are delicious. They tend to be delicious, but they're totally not necessary, and there's no such thing as an essential dietary carbohydrate.
Yes, sir.
Eat meat, eat fat. That seems to work pretty well.
Yes, sir. And just to add on to your point of limiting beliefs, it's all in your head. This study does kind of talk about it a little bit by saying that just the mere fact of thinking that you had a breakfast that filled you gave you equal performance to that of a person having carbohydrates, right? So having a placebo meal that fills you up, taking your hunger away, gave you equal performance to the person that actually had a real breakfast made of carbohydrates. So that's it's pretty interesting. Hunger suppression, thinking that you had some food, even just the tasting food could even impact your performance. So yeah, power of the mind. First you got to believe, and then perhaps that's all you need, just belief itself. And then obviously you need proper food afterwards.
Just believe you can live off the ether.
Just off the air. Some clean fuel. That would require
like our fellow Atlanteans did back in the day.
Yeah. Limitless energy, supposedly, from the Atlantis people.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we had one comment. MD says, "Really digging your content, boys. Thanks." Hey, shout out MD. Thank you for tuning in, man. Appreciate you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, it was a lot to cover, but yeah, a lot of studies were reviewed in this systematic review, and that the key point is energy balance. If you equate energy between carbs and fat, you have equal advantage. There's no disadvantage between carb or fat. Right? Don't let this don't think that the lack of carbohydrates are holding you back.
Yeah. It's the bad advice that's holding you back, telling you that calories don't matter more than the carbs. So
Yes. Yeah, actually, people telling you that calories don't matter is what's holding you back, because you may be under consuming, because you're losing weight, you're under consuming energy. So naturally, you're just going to have less energy available throughout the day because you're consuming less. And that will, by definition, impact your workout performance. It's not the lack of carbohydrates. So what people do is, they keep the same food, but then they add a carbohydrate, something as simple as honey, and suddenly they have more. By mere fact, they kept the same food of the day plus honey. Now you're consuming more energy for the day. Now you're feeling a little bit better for the workout, right? You're consuming a little bit more.
Yeah,
that's just one example.
Now you're back on the sugar coping, sugar addiction journey. So congrats, you played yourself. Calorie denialism meets grass-fed maximalism meets carb coping. Basically just describe the Ray Pete agenda.
Yes. that is the yes. Yeah, man.
Oh, my carbs.
My carbs, man.
Yeah. Well, this in vitro study of cells showed that they need glucose. Jesus. Yeah, no critical thinking skills whatsoever.
I know, right?
Yeah. I'm happy to put that out there.
No critical thinking studies. No critical thinking out there.
Yeah, that's facts.
Whew, man. An hour and 20 minutes. We wanted to keep it under an hour, but we did what we could.
Yeah, but you wouldn't shut up, Jay.
I wouldn't shut up. I should have summarized better.
Should have just stopped at minute 59.
That's it. Tune in tomorrow. Yeah, we should have done that, actually.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Yeah. Let's wrap it up. I'm gonna go have dinner.
Let's wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok. Follow us in your hearts. And wishing you all a happy, healthy, higher nutrient dense era from here on forwards. See you all next time.